Let's start by doing some introductions. We're here in the dining hall at Newnham College on what is quite a Greek day. But never mind, I'm sure people will recognise the alcove that Jenny and I are sitting in. Jenny's very kindly, as the chair of the Gardens Committee, joined me to go round the gardens in between the rain showers, look at the various things that are happening in the garden, talk about the past history of the garden, what's happening now, and perhaps look a little bit to the future. Hopefully, she might even let you into a few secrets. You never know. So, Jenny, thank you very much for joining me today.
It's a pleasure.
Will you talk a little bit about the history of the garden, whose vision it was, why we see the garden as it is today?
So, Sarah, you do have to start with the most difficult question, because the history of the garden is really convoluted. And as you know, the first principal, Anne Jemima Clough, was decided that we should have gardens. And when they were at Morton Hall, the garden was very central to the life of Newnham students. And when they built Newnham, starting with Newnham Hall, and then became South Hall, now called Sidrick Hall, the gardens remained central. And it actually, in the original configuration of the buildings, they had their own separate gardens and tennis courts and croquet courts, and so the halls were completely separate because they were separated by a lane, a public right-of-way that ran right through the middle of the gardens, and we'll go and have a look at that later, because it's fascinating. There's a great photograph of North Hall, which has railings and a road and a post box outside, so it looks just like a suburban dwelling.
And there's still a lamppost, isn't there?
Yeah.
A listed lamppost.
So Anne Jemima Clough thought girls should have exercise and fresh air and be able to grow their own vegetables, ideally, but also she had the concept of that everybody should have a garden of their own, even if it was just a bit of a window box if you lived in town. So I guess her vision has carried on, and one of the constants of people coming back to Newnham is that they go, everybody thinks it's their garden. So their view out the window, nobody ever wants anything changed apart from people who complain that they can't see out their window. But it's very personal, and the whole of Newnham's gardens are very personal. Anne Jemima Clough's niece, Blanche Athena Clough, who really got the gardens into this sort of shape that they actually are now. So she commissioned a landscape architect called, I suppose he was Gardner, I don't know if he's an architect or gardener then, called Backhouse and Sons, and they did the first plan of the gardens, some of which we adopted, being Newnham, and in fact the paths, the layout of the paths is pretty much as was designed by Backhouse. I think if we look at the plans of the gardens, we have 4 of these plans. We have the Backhouse plan, we have the Watson plan, we have Gertrude Jekyll's plan, all of which are fascinating because there's a theme, that Newnham took the bits they wanted to do and they didn't do other bits. So every single plan has bits that are still in the garden, so the paths, somebody from the late 1800s would recognise the path layout because that's how it was in those days.
Because if anybody saw the film that we made with Lottie, who's our current head gardener, you can see the great long borders before they're planted up, and as a gardener myself, you look at those and you think, they're going to take some planting, but they just transform the place when they're growing and then sort of come into maturity, just look absolutely amazing.
And they are really important because, of course, the long borders that run between Clough and what's now a magnolia that was a sundial, they come into their own for graduation, so we make sure that they're looking absolutely splendid for graduation. So pretty much everybody has a photograph of themselves with those long borders, which have this sort of real Jekyll feel.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about whether the gardens, you've talked about Jekyll, you've talked about the long borders, whether Newnham follows any sort of trendy trends. So if you as a gardener, if you go to Chelsea and you see what's new on the block, is that something that the gardeners here look to, or is it very much based on the ethos that you've already talked about?
You know, since I've been here, our head gardeners were first Tony Arnold and now Lottie Collis. Both of them are very interested in garden design. Tony was a great plantsman, and they would go to Chelsea every year and get ideas.
So the new gardens around the Dorothy Garrett building look amazing. Tell me a bit more about them. What I know from the Country Life feature that was recently published on 28th of April, if anybody wants a copy, the architects of the Dorothy Garrett building took inspiration from the Basil Champneys building. Do the gardens do the same thing?
Yes, well, we really wanted to reflect the gardens, and so they're completely modern, completely new, but we wanted them to look as though they belonged to Newnham, so we didn't want something very fancy. And the landscapers Britta and Guillaume did an amazing job in that they listened to what Newnham wanted, and they gave us a great design that it is very modern. And if you look at it objectively, you see it is not a copy of any of the gardens that we have in the rest of the grounds, but it fits in beautifully. And the Strachey Gardens, which are behind on the town side of the Dorothy Garrett building, were also a challenge because we needed to move the gates, the memorial gates, and so we wanted to be able to look through the gates at something that was typically Newnham. And those plantings, Lottie, actually, the garden team grew all of the plants for those gardens, by the way, many thousands of plants over a couple of years to save us a lot of money. But Lottie designed the planting for those squares, and I think they're amazingly successful. And we have two other gardens that are with the new buildings: the rooftop garden, which not many people will see, including a lavender garden, which when you're sitting in the meeting room, in another year or so, you should be able to look out over a sea of lavender and species tulips, lots of bees. And we also have the Philippa Fawcett garden, which is designed on mathematical principles, which is fantastic. So it's all designed around the Fibonacci series. And
did Lottie design that one as well?
No, Gwen Baum designed that one. But you know, all of this was done collaboratively with the garden committee. We had many meetings about this, and the landscape architects asked college what they thought and what they wanted. But it was Guillaume's idea to have the Fibonacci series. Brilliant idea. But these things evolved beautifully, and I'm very happy with all of those gardens. I think they've fitted what we needed them to do, and we've had a couple of parties up on when the last principal Carol Black left. We had a great party up on the roof terrace with the gardens when they were brand new, and you know we're very, very happy about them.
As someone who's just sort of just joined Newnham, April 2020, I've obviously seen none of the planting or the building going on, but coming in with it all sort of finished and looking spectacular, it's been such a treat, and it's sort of kept everybody going through lockdown. It's really, really quite something to have achieved that. So congratulations as the chair, and I know there's a whole team behind you, but certainly congratulations. So let's move on slightly to that first look at gardens. So if you're looking at the garden for the first time, you come into Newnham as a guest or perhaps a first year student, or you bring your family, what would you, as chair of the gardens committee, what would you point out that was a must see moment?
Well, I don't think there is a must see moment. If you come into the gardens first, the first thing you will see is wow, and you don't go, oh, look at that beautiful cutleaf beech, or look at that myrtle. You go, wow, these are beautiful gardens. And that is what I think you should get from a first time. You can walk on the grass, unlike many other colleges who have gardens, all of our gardens are completely accessible. We don't have a fellows garden here. All the gardens are completely accessible to everybody in college. Obviously sitting right outside somebody's room is a no-no, but there is plenty of space. And so that's what I'd say, just walk on the lawn, enjoy it. Go onto Clough Lawn, which in the summer is usually covered in students, but there's always a quiet place you can go to.
Yes, because it's big enough, isn't it? And there's corners that are less frequented than others.
So first time gardener, a person, I'd say just have a walk around all the paths and have a look at our beautiful borders, and then come back the following week, because they will be different, because we have the most amazing succession planting in the borders. So every week there's something new, something different, something very cool. There's Sternbergia, which come out for a couple of weeks in the autumn. There's the irises, which are only in flower for a couple of weeks at the end of the spring, but they're spectacular.
That is the thing, when you walk through the gardens, and as a gardener myself, the mounds that the plants create is so satisfying. And to see a great long border of all these beautiful mounds, and then the next week you'll see the mounds with spikes coming up, and then the next week it's the mounds with spikes and the flowers, and you just think, wow, that's that, as you say, wow, you look at it and you just think it's extraordinary.
And if you've got time, you should just sit for a while, because we also have a lot of birds. So one of the things we've always done is encourage biodiversity before it was fashionable. So all of we use as few chemicals as possible. There are some birds we try to discourage, like the birds that dig up the lawn looking for cockchafers, but we have green woodpeckers, we have wrens, we have all kinds of birds in here.
And there are lots of bird boxes as well, aren't there, around?
Yeah.
Have you got bee boxes as well?
We've got beehives, so we've had, unfortunately, a couple of years ago somebody destroyed our beehives by removing the lid in the winter, which is a bit of a shame, but Lottie's now got a new hive, and the hives in what's going to be now our sustainable garden. So they used to be in the vacant lot next door to the allotments, but now it's a part of the sustainable garden. So bees are important for the garden, and then we get honey, hopefully.
Because Lottie is a trained beekeeper.
She's a trained beekeeper, yeah.
On top of everything else. So quite, Newnham is very lucky to have you both. Tell me what secrets there might be in the garden.
Now, why would I do that? Why would I tell you the secret?
Because this is the audience that likes a secret, and we can
okay. Well, what I could tell you is so you asked about somebody who comes to the garden for the first time, but what I think is people who've lived here for a year or two, and then you say, well, I will meet you at the end of the nut work, and they will go, where's that? Or I'll meet you. Now people do know where the iris borders are, but previously I'd say, well, let's meet at the observatory, and they'd go, I didn't know we had an observatory. Or I could say, let's meet at the Alice Hopkinson sundial. Do you know where that is?
Personally, no. But I can find it.
So these are not secrets, but they're special places. Or I could say, and for me, some of the trees that flower, there's a myrtle that I love, because I've not got a myrtle, and I just like the name. So we've got special places which aren't secret, because nothing is secret in Newnham. You can go anywhere. So there are special places. So the squares that Gertrude Jekyll probably had in her plan, they're nice, and we've been refurbishing those. The sundials, we've got 4 sundials, one of which sadly is lost. It's Newnham, but we have sundials. We have special plants. We have orchids in the meadows, but nothing secret, because and you can ask the gardener. If you say, do you have somewhere I could stroll? And the gardener would say, well, why don't you meander around the walk? Because that was what it was designed for. So the meadows, these meandering paths, although they may drive you crazy because you can't get to anywhere particularly quickly, they were designed for strolling.
But the nut walk particularly is lovely for walking in, especially
the nut walk is, but that has only recently been refurbished, as it were. So because it's coppiced, and we coppice it every couple of years, and Lottie's planted thousands and thousands of bluebells. So now in the spring it's gorgeous.
There's like 10,000 bulbs planted over the winter.
So we've got, and we're actually, that's the area that we're concentrating on, because it's not visited enough. So it's not secret, but it's a quiet part of the garden, and it's really beautiful, and that's the part of the garden that we're currently looking at redeveloping.
But carefully and slowly.
Well, nobody will notice, because nobody knew it was a bit overgrown, and that's the problem, is people who did know it was a nice overgrown corner of the garden want it to be like that when they go back.
Yes.
So how you make it polished and overgrown at the same time is the challenge, but I think we rise to the challenge.
Absolutely.
We should go down there, because it's very pretty.
Yeah, exactly. So you've talked about how this balance. What would a new gardener, someone, I've just moved to a new garden. I'm sort of starting from scratch, and Jenny is very kindly agreeing to come and have a look at it. What would you say to a new gardener? What could a new gardener learn? Somebody who's just started gardening, learn from these gardens.
Okay, a new gardener could learn that you don't have to have a very big space to have a very attractive garden, because you could take any one of the bits of borders and look at them and go, oh, I like that. And you can say, okay, it's yay long, yay wide. You could do that. You could also ask the gardeners how much work it is to do any of these things. So if you say, oh, I'd love long borders like that, look at the amount of work is involved. But then so we've just planted the vegetable borders. So we have annual borders that, for a couple of years, Lottie just planted annual flowers, and then last year we decided to plant incredible edibles. And Lottie, it was a difficult year last year because of the lockdown, but we had a great vegetable border, annual border, that had vegetables, and the students could come and pick the veggies when they grew, and it's now just been replanted. So if you're a new gardener, you could look at that and say, I could do a bit of garden just like that.
An element of that. Yeah.
And you could also look at our failures, that every so often something dies, and when something dies we go, should we try and let it recover, should we just hoik it out? And that's something a new gardener could learn as well, that the fun of it is making mistakes. Well, actually it's no fun to make mistakes, but the garden's very forgiving. If something dies, you can replace it.
Yeah, indeed.
So new gardeners could, and you could just take inspiration from it, that you don't have to have a garden this size, but if you like particular elements, then you can have that in any size garden.
And of course you can look at all the different roses and smell the different roses, and talk to Lottie about which ones would work well somewhere else. But there are some amazing smells all around the garden, aren't there, including the herb garden. And
if you had a very small courtyard garden, say you had a garden that was very small and shady, there are small shady parts of this garden that you could look at and go, oh, what plants grow well there?
Is there anything that you have taken from this garden as inspiration and sort of transplanted it, excuse the pun, into your own garden?
I think not the garden I have at present, because I designed that before I came to Newnham, but the garden that I'm going to have next is going to be a Newnham inspired garden, because I'm going to, I know I've just said it's a lot of work to do long borders, but I love our long borders, and we have a house in New Zealand that I am going to plant at least one long border while I'm still able to garden it, that will take inspiration from Newnham. And I'd like a planting copy, so I go, oh yes, I need 2 of those, 6 of those, because that's what is hard to do as an amateur gardener, know what to put in that will flower when. So just copying somebody else's garden is a brilliant idea.
And what would an experienced gardener pick up, be influenced by from this garden?
An experienced gardener will look at the plants and say, oh, I didn't know you could grow one of those here, or mine doesn't grow very well there. And an experienced gardener can come around and say, I really want to grow peonies and a different sort of plant. Where can I grow it? Look at sites. An experienced gardener will love the plants here, because we have some amazing, very unusual plants, and
because that's the thing. Peonies have become very trendy, haven't they?
Yeah.
But Newnham presumably has always had peonies.
We have. Yeah.
So another sort of strike for Newnham. As the chair of the garden committee and obviously integrally responsible for the brilliance of our gardens, along with Lottie and her team, what are you most proud of? What are the achievements of this garden?
Oh, it isn't to do with me, but what I really am proud of is how beautiful the gardens look, and that's the garden team works incredibly hard, and the look of the gardens is stunning. And when I first came to Newnham, I didn't mean to come to Newnham. I accepted the invitation to lunch out of politeness, really. I had never been in a single-sex institution, but I looked at the gardens and I thought, wow, these are amazing. Yeah. And I wanted to be part of that, and I think being part of the way the gardens have developed and subtle changes, they're very different from how they were in 1991, but fundamentally the same. The irises, we have an iris border, we've developed some, and getting the iris breeders on board with that was fun and interesting, and it's just now accepted that it's part of Newnham, and I think that's, as an individual, you disappear without trace when you're no longer associated with it, but certain things linger on. I'm very happy about the Strachey Gardens, which is, odd, little tiny bits of things that you go, maybe we shouldn't do that, or maybe we should do that. Subtle changes that, I hope I haven't left a fingerprint at all on the gardens, but that I've left them better than they were when we started, and the next person to come along will leave them better again, but not that different.
Yeah. Which leads me to my last question. Then you've already said that they wouldn't be that different. What would the gardens possibly look like, say, in 50 years?
I hope in 50 years' time that we could come back, although we probably will be long since
yes, indeed.
Being fertiliser, I hope.
Yes.
That we'd come back and we'd recognise the gardens, that we would say, oh, these look much the same as they did when I was here, and still beautiful and still fulfilling their function as being the garden of people's homes, that college still exists as a university college and people live here, I hope. And if they do that, then the gardens won't have been built on, that we'll still have playing fields for sport. Although I do think that the pandemic has really made people realise how important urban green spaces are, and that we're unbelievably lucky to have 17 acres of fantastic gardens. So I hope they won't be very different, but there will be new planting, that there will be changes, that the trees will be here, that some of the small trees that we planted, big trees, some of the big trees will have died. So we still have some elm trees here. I expect that in 50 years' time they will no longer exist, but when they fall down, you get a new space, and that's planted by a new creative designer, head gardener. And
do you think that the gardens are already in a good position to resist climate change, or do you think more work needs to be done in that element?
More work always needs to be done in making a garden sustainable. We are going to have a water recycling system, so we can collect water off our many roofs, so that, because that water is going to become incredibly important. We already do things as organically as possible. We have plants that grow well here and will be sustainable. I don't know what climate change is going to bring. I think having lawns that the lawns are fundamentally part of the Newnham look. I personally think it would be a shame if we lost that but we can change the grass. There's grasses that grow better in dry climates, so I think we have to move with the times, but to keep the look of how things are, rather than say lawns are unsustainable, so we won't have lawns. No, we go, this grass is unsustainable, so let's still have a lawn, but let's have a different kind of grass. So being adaptable, creative, scientific about what we do.
Jenny, thank you so much for joining me today. It's been a real pleasure talking to you about the gardens, which have, even in my short time here, been so inspirational to me.
Shall we go for a walk then?
Should we go for a walk then?